Good morning, church. It's good to see you all here this morning. I want to remind you that we're getting really close to Easter, and I hope you've been keeping up with the Lent devotional. We're not too far from Good Friday, and we will be having a Good Friday service like we do here, and so that'll be on April 7th at 7 p.m. We'll be here in the auditorium, so come and be a part of the Good Friday service as we prepare ourselves to celebrate resurrection. But you can't truly appreciate resurrection until you've experienced the darkness of the cross. And so we want to spend that Good Friday together and then prepare ourselves for Easter. And I also want to remind you that on Easter we will have our normal service times, but we won't have Bible classes in the middle. We're going to have like a combined kind of fellowship time. There'll be extra like pastries and stuff out there and coffee, and it's just kind of a time for us to hang out and, maybe if there's some people in the early service you don't see very often or get to talk to, spend some time with them, and I encourage them to do the same with you. And so in between the services, we're just going to be kind of hanging out in the fellowship hall, in the lobby there, just in relationship and communion together. This morning, we're going to be continuing our series that we started a while back called No Name, where we're looking at stories in the Gospels where Jesus had an encounter with someone that we don't know their name. We don't know who they are other than the ways the story describes them. And this morning, we're going to be looking at a story that Raj actually alluded to in his communion comments. It's in John chapter 5. John chapter 5. And I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 15 of John chapter 5. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And one was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred, and while I'm trying to get in, someone else always goes down ahead of me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up. Pick up your mat and walk." And at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and began to walk. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." "But," he replied, "the man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" And so they asked him, Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" And the man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." And the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. This is the word of the Lord to us today. And as I was preparing for the sermon, I couldn't help but think of a great scene from the classic "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" It's a scene where Delmar has gone into the river to be baptized. He comes up out of that water and he starts saying, "The preacher has said that all of my sins have been washed away, that they've all been forgiven. Even that time I held up that Piggly Wiggly in Yazoo City." And Everett kind of had a look on his face, and he said, "Well, Delmar, you said you were innocent of those charges." And he said, "Well, I was lying, and the preacher says that I've been forgiven of that sin too." And then this is the part that I really remember, then he holds his arms out and he throws his head back and he says, "Come on in, boys, the water is fine. Come on in, boys, the water is fine." I was thinking about that because this story today is about a pool. It's a pool that many people in Jesus' day, they thought that it had some sort of miraculous healing power to it. Now, archaeologists have actually found like the remains of this pool and even the colonnades. And so, next time you're casually passing through Jerusalem, be sure to stop and check it out. But occasionally, the waters in this pool were said to start like bubbling and kind of get like this whirlpool, kind of hot tub effect. And the thought was that as soon as someone got in the waters when it was doing that you would receive healing. We know now that what was happening was that there were some natural springs under this pool that would occasionally start acting up or erupting a little bit, and it would stir the waters and make it have that kind of effect. But in Jesus' day, what they thought was happening, this was the tradition of the day, was that there were angels from heaven that would come down and they would stir the water with their fingers. And whenever the waters got stirred by the finger of the angels, that the first person, it wasn't everybody, the first person that was in the pool would receive healing. And I can't help but think that first person who gets in the pool every time being like Delmar. Come on in, boys, the water is fine. Come on in, the water is fine. And so Jesus finds himself there by this pool, and for some reason he focuses all of his attention on this one gentleman that the text says was an invalid. Now, we don't know really what that means, what the ailment was. Our best guess is that it probably had something to do with his legs, that he was unable to walk. Many scholars think that he was probably carried to this pool by friends and laid there every day. And for some reason, Jesus has focused his attention on this one guy and found out that he had been an invalid. He's been in this condition for 38 years of his life. And I've often wondered when I read the story, why this one guy? Right? Why did Jesus focus on this one guy? I mean, this pool is apparently surrounded by all sorts of people that had all sorts of disabilities and illnesses and ailments, and it was all people of all ages, and it was men and women, and we believe that Jesus had the capacity in him, the power in him to heal them all. Why this one guy? I preached a sermon on this text many years ago, and at that time on that sermon, I really focused on this idea of like, sometimes it seems like God's grace is a little unfair, right? All of them needed healing, but this one guy gets it. It's like the one person when a tornado comes through and this one person's house is up and they just say, well, I just prayed to God and prayed and he answered my prayers. And I always think like, well, didn't everybody else on the street pray too? And sometimes it's kind of this story where you're like, God's grace just kind of lands in different places and you're kind of like, this isn't always fair. And so I wonder why Jesus, why focus on this one guy? I wonder if it's kind of like the runt of the litter. I don't know if you know much about the runts of the litter, but, you have the runt and of a litter of puppies, and, it comes time for all the sibling puppies. They're all getting ready to go nurse, and this runt's just too weak, too feeble to be able to get to it. And so while the sibling puppies are nursing and getting the nutrients they need, this runt is not able to get there and misses out on food. And eventually over time, they get weaker and weaker until eventually it kind of leads to the runt's death. And I wonder, like, is this guy like the runt of the disabled at this pool? Like, Jesus says, do you want to get well? And he's like, look, I try and I just can't get to the pool. Every time I try to make my way, and I don't know if he's like crawling with his arms. I don't know how he's getting there, but he says, I eventually get there, but by the time I get there, there's other people in front of me who have already gone in. And I wonder, it's like the runt, like he can't get to the thing that's supposed to give him his healing. Everyone beats him to it. And I wonder, is this what drew Jesus to this man? I don't know. But after hearing his story, Jesus says to him, okay, get up. You want to be healed. You say you keep wanting to get to the pool, but everybody beats you to it. So get up. Pick up your mat and walk. And John tells us in the story, he says, at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. And so far, I think, man, this is a pretty cool story. Right? Healed after 38 years of being an invalid. And I think that's pretty cool. And this is even more amazing. Jesus seems to heal him out of his own sense of compassion and mercy, not out of any sort of presence of faith in this guy's life because faith seems to be completely absent from the story. This guy didn't know who Jesus was. And faith seems to be completely absent. And so later he's asked, who healed you? And he's like, I don't know. Some guy just told me to get up and walk, and then he disappeared. I don't know his name. I don't know what he looks like. He doesn't know who Jesus is. And I think that makes this a really unique healing story in the Gospels because almost every other healing story you come across in the Gospels, there's always this affirmation, your faith has made you well. Right? There's this presence of faith. But you can't say that about this story. He doesn't know Jesus. He didn't seek Jesus out. He didn't even ask Jesus to do anything. It seems that Jesus, out of his own sense of compassion, out of his own sense of mercy for this individual, it seems that Jesus just acts on his own out of love and compassion, apart from any sign of faith to heal him. And I got to say, I like this Jesus. Now, I like all versions of Jesus, but I really like this Jesus, right? That out of his own broken heart, out of his own sense of compassion and mercy, without any faith being present, he offers healing. But here's the thing. I don't think this story has anything to do with the miracle. And I don't think this story has anything to do with faith and the presence of faith or the absence of faith. I really don't think this story has much to do about the man who receives his healing. And so the question is, okay, so then what's the story about? If it's not about that, then what's it about? And I think John gives us a really big clue as to what the story's about when right after he says the man was immediately cured and he picked up his mat and began walking, John then says this: the day on which this took place was the Sabbath. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath. And John's letting us know right there in that statement that this isn't a story about miracles. And it's not a story about faith and belief and whether it's there or whether it's not there. But rather, this is a story that is about the Sabbath. But to take it a little bit deeper, because we're not really kind of in the place of the Jews where we kind of have that Sabbath understanding. It's not just about the Sabbath, it's a story about controversy. But to take it even deeper, it's not just about any controversy, it's a story about religious controversy. It's a story that I think is really first and foremost about religion and priorities. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. I think that's so important to the story. You see, the religious leaders during this time, they see this man walking down the street carrying a mat. Never mind the fact that he'd been an invalid for 38 years and couldn't walk at all, and now he's carrying his mat. Never mind all of that. What really is important is that he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath, and how dare you do such a thing? Because our law says that can't happen. Our prophets of old told us that that is not what you do on the Sabbath. I don't care that you've been healed. Wait until the next day to carry your mat. Because Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 17, be careful not to carry any load on the Sabbath day or to bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your house or do any work on the Sabbath, but rather keep the Sabbath day holy, as I have commanded your ancestors. How dare he break this law? Yeah, you were healed, that's good. But there's still commands to be followed. And so they confront him about it. Well, they confront him, and he passes the buck. He says, look, it wasn't me. This guy told me to pick up the mat. Like, if he hadn't told me to do it, I wouldn't have done it. But this guy, he's the one who came over and told me. And there's some scholars who suggest that maybe there's like some Genesis 3 echo in this. Remember Genesis 3? You've got the fall of Adam and Eve, and you got Adam sitting there with that fruit in his hand, and God says, how can you do this? And he says, hey, it was that woman you put in the garden. She's the one who told me to do it. God confronts the woman, and the woman says, well, it was that serpent that was in the garden. He told me. Like, they're just passing the buck, and so scholars say there's a lot of echoes of Genesis 3 in this guy's response when they say, how dare you do this? Hey, it wasn't me, it was this guy. He told me to do it. I wouldn't have done it if he hadn't told me to. They ask him, okay, well, if someone told you to do it, then who was it? And again, there seems to be no real sense of faith in this story or belief because this guy has no clue who it was who told him to do it. Jesus, again, seems to have just healed him out of his own sense of compassion, out of his own sense of mercy, not because he saw faith in this guy. And this guy didn't know Jesus before it happened, and he doesn't know him still after it happened. This isn't like the demoniac that Zach talked about a few weeks ago, that as soon as he's healed, he says, Jesus, I'm following you wherever you go. No, this guy was healed. Jesus disappeared, and the guy goes, okay, I'm going to go about my life. And he goes about his life. And so now they're like, who told you this? He says, I don't know. I have no clue. I can't even tell you what he looks like. Jesus eventually finds him again. This time he's in the temple. We don't know why. Maybe he's worshiping. Maybe he's going through some kind of ritual cleansing. But Jesus finds him in the temple, and Jesus says something to him that, man, has really bothered a lot of people for a long time. And I got to say, it kind of bothers me, and I wrestle with what to do with it. He finds him, and he says, see, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. And what does that mean? Is Jesus somehow saying that there's a connection between his sin and his disability? And if he's saying that, well, then that seems to be kind of the opposite of what he says later on in John when he and his disciples come upon this guy who was blind, and the disciples go, okay, Jesus, who sinned in this situation that he was born blind? Was it his family? Like, who? There's got to be sin in here somewhere. And Jesus in that situation says, no, sin had nothing to do with this. And so on one hand, it seems like he says sin has nothing to do with, a disability or something. But on the other hand, it seems like he could be saying that possibly there is a connection between it. Like, which one is it? And I got to say, I don't know if I'm really comfortable with that. Now, I know it's not about me, and it's not about what makes me comfortable and, what sits well with me. But I just want to be honest and say it doesn't really sit well with me if he is making a connection between this guy's disability and sin. I have kind of an approach to this that I want to share with you, and then we can move on because my sermon's not really about this, but I know we got to talk about it. My approach to this is that I think what really Jesus is saying here is something like, you know what, the last 38 years of your life have been rough. It's no way to live. But there are worse things in life, and if you keep sinning, you're going to experience those things that are worse. Does that kind of make sense? It's not that he's making a connection between sin and his disability and saying, hey, you know what? You've been in this situation because of your sin, and if you keep sinning, it's only going to get worse. I don't think he's saying that as much as I think he's just saying, like, I know the last 38 years have been bad. Like, that's no way to live. But, keep sinning, you're going to experience something that can be worse in life. So I don't know if that makes sense to you. That's kind of the way I read it. But like I said, that's not really the point of my sermon this morning, so let's move on. I'll let you deal with that later. So if that's not what the story's about, then what's the point of the story? What's the takeaway of the story? And I think really the story is aimed at religious people. I think it's a story that's aimed at Christians. I think it's a story that's aimed at me, and it's aimed at you. I think it's a story that is aimed at religious people whose actions suggest that they value religious traditions and doctrines more than they value the well-being of other people. That when it comes down to it, that the do's and the don'ts of your religion are more important than the well-being of other people. And so I think really what the story is about is the story kind of serves as a critique of those who are more focused on command following than they are on people loving. And I think really that's a really hard thing for us to take, coming from a heritage that we come from, and not just ours, but other evangelical traditions that are very conservative in nature, which is kind of our heritage, a very conservative in nature heritage that really places a high premium on the idea of finding the right commands and obeying the right commands and getting church right and doing all those things, to then hear that like there's this critique between like command following versus people loving is kind of a hard thing for us, because then that like we have to wrestle with that balance. But I really think that's what the story is about. It's about those religious people who get really hung up on the command-following aspect and lose sight of the people-loving part of what Jesus really calls us to. So in other words, what's more important to you, people or rules? People or rules? Now, Taylor's back here. Many of you know that for last handful of years, Taylor's done a Faith in KC online interview thing where he interviews different faith leaders in the Kansas City area, and I know a lot of you have followed that. And I remember, as I was thinking about the sermon, I remember one that Taylor, you did with a Jewish rabbi. It's been a number of years ago. I can't remember his name now, but a Jewish rabbi that was here in Overland Park, and there was something that the rabbi said that just stood out to me, and it's kind of stuck with me ever since he said it. And it was, I think the context of it was the idea of like COVID and how our faith groups kind of approaching COVID and protocols and all that kind of stuff. And what he said was, he said, the highest tenet of the Jewish faith is this: do no harm. He says the highest tenet of our faith. That is at the very pinnacle of who we are as a people, and what we are to do is that we are to be a people who do no harm. And that really stuck with me when I heard that, and I've been thinking about that a lot. And it came back to me as I was looking at this text. There's an ancient Jewish phrase that I'm going to butcher as I try to say it, but I'm going to try to say it anyway. It's pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh. And what pikuach nefesh basically states in the Jewish faith is, it says this, that saving a life or not harming a life, so saving a life, not harming a life, both kind of consider the same thing. Saving a life, not harming a life, overrides any and all other commands, even the ones that are most near and dear to our hearts, such as the Jewish faith saying the Sabbath. That saving a life or not harming a life overrides Sabbath commands. It overrides all other commands. That if it comes down to having to obey a command or to save a life, or if it comes down to obeying a command or making sure someone isn't harmed, you always break the command so that you can save the life, or so that you can make sure the other life is not harmed. Do no harm. Pikuach nefesh. What is more important to you, people or rules? And I know what you're thinking when you hear that, because it's what I was thinking, and it's the way I was raised, and that is, well, isn't that a slippery slope? I grew up and I heard like that slippery slope term like every turn and corner. Like anytime anybody want to do something, well, isn't that a slippery slope? Like, we start clapping, isn't that a slippery slope? And here's the thing. I don't think Jesus gets all that worked up about slippery slopes. Jesus seems to be, all throughout the Gospels, right and left, he's breaking Jewish traditions and Jewish commands and all these things, all for the sake of making sure that he can save a life. Or so that he makes sure that a life is not harmed, or so that he can make sure that someone experiences healing or experiences the love of God, which is why he says the greatest of all the commands is to love God and love neighbor. To love God and love neighbor. And here's the thing. If my way of loving God prevents me from showing love to my neighbor, then maybe my way of loving God is wrong. If my way of loving God prevents my neighbor from being able to experience the love of God, then maybe my way of loving God is wrong. Because you can't separate love of God and love of neighbor. They go hand in hand. And these Jewish leaders, they were playing the role of like church police. They were playing the role of confronting command breakers when what they should have been doing is celebrating a man who for 38 years couldn't walk. And now on the Sabbath, he's able to carry his mat. They should have been celebrating that instead of confronting him about breaking the law. They got so preoccupied with the fact that the mat was being carried that they lost sight of the man carrying the mat. And I think it gets real easy for us to do that. That we can become so preoccupied with the command or the tradition or whatever it is that's being broken that we lose sight of the human being that's standing in front of us that either is or isn't experiencing the love of God in that moment. And so as we kind of wrap this up and kind of wrestle with the impact or the implication of the story, I just kind of want to end with a plea. And that plea is this: let us not ever lose sight of our first priority, which is to love. Let us never lose sight of that first priority, and may we always be known as a people who do good, not harm. And may we always be a people who celebrate when a man who had been an invalid for 38 years is able to carry a mat on the Sabbath day. Even on the Sabbath, may we celebrate the healing of that man. Let us never lose sight of our first priority, which is to love first. Let's stand and let's sing.